Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this year's edition of the Infinite Dial from Edison Research and Triton Digital. I'm Edison Research SVP Tom Webster, and things are a little bit unusual this year. And, circumstances for everybody are a little strange. I'm coming to you from my living room here, or my kitchen table here in Boston, where in Boston we've been practicing social distancing for about 250 years, John. So we're getting pretty good with it. And I'm joined, of course, by my good friend John Rosso from Triton Digital. Hello, John.
Hiya, Tom. It's great to be here for the work from home edition of the Infinite Dial. Hopefully,
100%.
we all have the appropriate bandwidth to pull this off. I may have to go kick the kids off of Netflix if we don't.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is the first Infinite Dial that we've done from my kitchen table, and it's also it's gratifying to know that this is the highest rated live sports show in America right now.
I think it's actually worth noting that our registration this year was higher than ever, and about 40% of those registrations came in the last week or 8 days or so since we announced that we weren't going to be holding the live event. And I think that's there's a couple of reasons for that. First, as you know, Infinite Dial, it's kind of like the Super Bowl where a lot of people get together and have big parties to watch, right? This year, because of social distancing, people are registering and watching on their own. But I also think there's a certain component of, people right now are looking for normalcy, and this is about as normal as it gets, the two of us talking about online audio.
This is about as normal as it gets, the two of us. I'm not sure about that, but we're very grateful that you're here, recognizing that these are in fact extraordinary times. But we're going to put on the big show for you this week, as we like to do. Just a reminder for everyone that the hashtag today is hashtag Infinite Dial. A number of you are already using it. Elsie Escobar has asked, I wonder if John and Tom are wearing pants. And I can't speak for myself, but John is not. John is 100% not wearing pants, but do tweet using the hashtag, and if you happen to take a hashtag Infinite Dial selfie, we're down with that too. We'll figure out a way to do that. But let's get started with the data. So without any further ado, here we're going to shut off the old webcam and get to that withering torrent of slides that you all came here for. So first of all, I'd like to remind everybody the Infinite Dial is the longest running survey of digital media consumer behavior in America. And we've been at this since 1998. This is the 23rd year of the Infinite Dial, which puts us at that awkward age, John, of old enough to drink, but not old enough to rent a car. And I don't even know what to do in those tweener years. And this year, we've got a lot of great data on mobile behavior, internet audio, podcasting, of course, social media, smart speakers, and a few other great surprises. The methodology, as always, we use the gold standard for survey research methodology. This is a 1,500-person survey using random digit dialing to cell phones and landlines, about an equal measure in English and Spanish, so that it is, in fact, representative and projectable to the U.S. population. It's something that we take great care to do. And also, it's worth noting, we wrapped up the fielding here in late January, early February, before, I think, before COVID-19 probably threw a lot of media consumption habits into disarray. So I think this will, it's a good thing for the Infinite Dial that it will give us kind of a year-over-year, exact same time frame, exact same methodology look at the state of media consumption in America. We are, of course, tracking week to week and even day by day with our Share of Ear and podcast consumer tracker studies, just how current events may be affecting media consumption. So we will undoubtedly report on that in the near future. But that's how we do things here on the Infinite Dial. We take great pride in the methodology that we use and the care that we apply to figuring all of this out for you so that you can trust these numbers. So before we get into media behaviors and consumption patterns and things like that, probably the most important thing to look at here are the devices that we use to do these things, because so much of the media consumption and our media consumption habits are really driven by ready access to friction-free technology. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my friend John to tell us about media and technology.
All right, Tom, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Here we're looking at smartphone ownership, that most ubiquitous of media consumption devices, maybe second only to the TV and radio. Maybe this is the most ubiquitous digital media consumption device. And ownership of smartphones by Americans 12 plus and older has increased every year, as you can see here. But the growth is leveling off now at about 85% or 240 million people. Now it's likely that this number will continue to creep up in the coming years, but it's clear that the rapid growth of smartphone ownership is behind us. Now, Tom, I know you're controlling the slides. Would you like me to give you a beep like when, in film strip time in class back in elementary school? Because I can do that.
I think I can take the hint, John. Thanks.
Got it. Let's look now at tablet ownership, which also appears to have leveled off. It's been bouncing around the low to mid 50s for the past 5 years. Even though tablets don't have anywhere near the penetration of smartphones, 53% or about 149 million Americans own one or more of them. It's worth noting that of the 5 primary makers of tablets, that would be Apple, Samsung, Huawei, Amazon, and Lenovo, only Apple and Lenovo reported growth in sales of tablets last year. All the others lost ground. So the tablet market seems to have peaked and leveled off. Beep. Now moving from the larger screen to the tiny screen. After a year of very rapid growth where smartwatch ownership just about doubled from 2018 to 2019, it looks like ownership of smartwatches is now leveled off at 17%. That's about 48 million people. So we're seeing the market penetration of each of these categories of devices, smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches, all leveling off. Let's turn now to that other smart device that we are very, very interested in, and that would be smart speakers. On this chart, we trend awareness of smart speakers. This year, awareness remains pretty much flat to 2019 at 78%. It's hard to imagine who makes up that remaining 22%, given that marketing push behind these things is so huge. Apparently, some people still don't know about smart speakers, which seems unimaginable. I often wonder, the people who conduct the interviews for Edison, who are calling people and asking them, have you heard of a smart speaker? If someone hasn't and you have to describe to them what it is, what do you say? It's got to be an interesting interview. So that was awareness. Now we're moving on to the next slide, which is smart speaker ownership. So here we're trending ownership. Remember that the first smart speaker was Amazon's Echo, and it became broadly available early in 2015. So when we fielded our 2017 Infinite Dial survey 2 years later, 7% of Americans had already purchased one. Today, 76 million people, or about 27% of the 12 plus population, owns a smart speaker. Which ones do they own? Well, let's find out now. Amazon's Alexa-based products are the clear winner, and at 21% have almost twice the adoption of Google Home. Amazon's lead over Google is the result of getting there first. As I mentioned a moment ago, Amazon's Echo was released in the US at the beginning of 2015. It was almost another 2 years before Google released their smart speaker. It's interesting that Amazon doesn't have this kind of lead everywhere. In Canada, where Amazon and Google voice assistants became available within a few months of each other, the Google devices have a considerably larger share of the market. Now, you'll be able to find out more about this and other Canadian media and technology stuff when we present the Infinite Dial Canada later this year. Beep. A minute ago, we talked about smart speaker ownership growing from 23 to 27% of Americans 12 plus. In addition to the growing number of people who own smart speakers, we continue to see the number of units that they own increase. This kind of makes sense. If you get used to listening to Tom's podcast on the Echo in your kitchen, then why not bring him into the bedroom as well? In the last year's Infinite Dial, we saw the percentage of people who now own 2 or more speakers grow from 33 to 52%, with the mean number of speakers per household increasing from 1.7 to 2. Now let's rolling forward to 2020, as I see Tom has already done. The percentage owning 2 or more speakers is 55%, and the mean number of smart speakers per household has increased again from 2 to 2.2, which for those of you calculating along at home is a 10% increase. Now let's look at another piece of home media hardware, the radio. we've seen the number of broadcast radio receivers in the home decreasing year over year. In 2020, we find that 68% of people still have at least one radio receiver in their home. However, the mean number of radio receivers in the home has dropped again from 1.9 in 2019 to 1.5 in 2020. Beep. Let's see how in-home radio ownership varies across the demos now. The top bar is our 12 plus data for reference. And remember, amongst the 12 plus population, 68% have at least one radio in their home. That number drops to 48% among 18 to 34s, with the mean number of radio receivers in the home dropping to just below 1. That's a very different story with the 35 plus crowd, where 77% have at least one radio at home and the mean number of radios is 1.8. Cutting this data a different way, we're now looking at radio receiver ownership by those who also own a smart speaker. The percentages are pretty much the same, so it doesn't appear that the growth of smart speakers is causing a decline in prevalence of radios in the home. The story here is this. Even though smart speaker owners tell us that one of the things they use their speakers for most is listening to music and the streams of AM/FM radio stations, owners of smart speakers tend to look just like the rest of the population when it comes to radio ownership. Beep. Let's spend another minute looking at the intersection of radio and smart speaker ownership. Here we look at those who have a radio in their home, a smart speaker, both a radio and a smart speaker, or neither. The story here appears to be that smart speaker ownership is growing at about the same rate in both the radio owning and non-radio owning groups. I should note that this comparison is against 2018, as we did not ask this question in the 2019 edition of the Infinite Dial. Beep. Well, we've talked a lot about smart speakers, the hardware. Now let's focus on the software, and by that I mean the voice-operated personal assistant services that power these devices and are available on many other devices. We asked people on which devices they access services such as Alexa, Google Home, or Siri. The smartphone wins by a mile here, which is representative of the number of people who rely on Apple's Siri on their mobile device. What's really interesting, though, is this. Even though the ownership of smart speakers, the hardware specifically used to access these services, stands at about 27%, 62% of people tell us they're using voice assistants. So this speaks to the increasing number of things that have voice assistants built in, including TVs, kitchen appliances, and even now bathroom mirrors. It'll be really interesting to see how connected cars and devices like Amazon Auto drive this in the future. And in related news, here are Amazon Prime subscriptions, which, as you can see, are continuing to grow. A lot of people, 42%, 118 million Americans subscribe to Amazon Prime. You can do the math on that and figure out how much Amazon is billing monthly just on these Prime subscribers. It will be interesting to look back on this year of so much retail disruption to see what happens with Amazon Prime subscriptions post this initial COVID-19 response. So with that, that's media and technology. I will now send it back to Tom for social media.
Are you an Amazon Prime member, John?
I am an Amazon Prime member. Tom, how about you?
We just actually upgraded to Amazon Now, and that basically means that we've moved into the Amazon warehouse.
I didn't know there was a tier above Amazon Prime. Now I feel like I need to upgrade.
There is indeed. I don't know about you, John, but I'm spending a lot of time on TikTok, just making TikTok video after TikTok video. But in general, I think it's fair to say that social media usage in this country has essentially stalled. At the past 4 years, you can really just draw a straight line there in terms of the growth of social media. We're not, that aspect of our society is not really growing all that much. And you can see when you're looking at things like social media brand awareness, again, not tremendous changes here. You can see there's a little bit of growth with WhatsApp in terms of awareness from 54% to 59%. And then also we've debuted TikTok here at 64%. So it's a fairly strong debut in terms of awareness. Certainly TikTok videos have been spread on other social media platforms, which I think adds to that awareness. But in terms of the rest, there's not an incredible amount of growth in terms of brand awareness of these various platforms. Now let's take a look at usage. This is folks who currently ever use each of these platforms in social media. And again, there's the picture here is fairly static. Facebook stays pretty static. Snapchat, Pinterest, LinkedIn, Twitter, all fairly static year over year. You do see some growth again with Instagram, which has gone in 2 years from 36% of the population 12 plus to 41% of the population 12 plus. And TikTok, again, for us, has debuted at 11%. Last year, we reported that Facebook had really started to decline and had lost users, especially on the young end. And they seem to have really stabilized that this year. They've gone up just a skosh. You can really, I think, fairly call it flat year over year. But they have staunched the bleeding at Facebook and have kind of normalized and level off that little bit of a slide that they had. And you can really see the components of that when you look at Facebook demographically. When you look at 12 to 34, they definitely halted that slide there and kind of stabilized with a slight bump at 64%. 35 to 54 actually went up 5 percentage points from 69% to 74%. And I think that's probably from a glut of 35 to 54-year-olds reading our article from last year that Facebook was declining and figuring out, hey, that's where I want to be. And so they joined us. And then, of course, 55 plus really stayed static year over year. Last year, we took a look at 12 to 34 because we saw some definite trends there. And this year, I think, again, we do see a few interesting trends with 12 to 34, with TikTok especially, again, debuting at 25% of 12 to 34-year-olds, and a fair amount of growth for WhatsApp from 23% to 29%. But again, I think the most solid growth story here is Instagram. From 2018 to 2020, it's gone from 62% to 68%. So Instagram does continue to grow. With 12 to 34-year-olds, it is the #1 platform. It's a bit higher than Facebook, as you can see. And again, I think overall, social media platform usage has plateaued, but we are continuing to see a little bit of movement brand to brand here. And then if we look 35 and older, Facebook goes up a little bit over a couple of years from 59 to 62. But look at Instagram. Instagram, again, really is the only real significant growth story over the past 2 years. And now that 35 and older are on Instagram, I'm just speaking to my son now. I am watching you, and I know what you do. And of course, 35 and older, not big on the TikTok at 3% of 35 plus here in the United States. Now, we always ask, what is the social media brand that you use most often? And that has continued to be Facebook, at least in terms of the majority answer. And just as we have seen with the brand usage questions, Facebook has leveled off and even gained a little bit year over year. 54% of Americans 12 plus now say that Facebook is what they use most often. And the interesting thing here is what has shrunk really is Snapchat. 13% of Americans said Snapchat was what they used most often last year. This year it's 9%. And you can see the thing that has grown here are the others. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit as we look at 12 to 34. We look at 12 to 34. #1 here is Facebook at 32%, but very, very close behind Instagram at 27% in terms of 12 to 34-year-olds and the platform that they tell us they use most often. And what really has expanded here out of the other section, as it were, amongst the total 12 plus, you can see WhatsApp at 4% this year and TikTok at 3% most often. So those platforms are beginning to find a foothold. But all of that said, Facebook as a company and the combination of Facebook and Instagram still represent the majority here in terms of the social media brand that people use most often. So this year we wanted to talk about something that we just started tracking last year, and we're seeing a little bit of growth here year over year in terms of live streamed video games. And I know John does this a lot. I know John and we're just on Apex Legends 10 hours a day when we're supposed to be working. I hope our bosses aren't listening to this. The percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they've ever watched a live or streamed video game holds steady at 15. But the percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they've ever played a video game and streamed it live has gone up from 7% of Americans to 9% of Americans. So nearly 10% of Americans 12 plus say they have ever streamed a live video game. Now, as you might expect, this is led by men, but there are plenty of female gamers here. This year, again, 19% of men say they've ever watched a live stream video game. And certainly we're continuing to see the rise of esports, or on this day in 2020, as we call them, sports. But of course, again, there are plenty of female gamers. That remains where it was last year at 11%. Now, it does certainly happen mostly on the young end. When you look at 12 to 34-year-olds, over a quarter of 12 to 34-year-olds say they've ever watched a live streamed video game, some kind of esports broadcast. But 55 plus, it's actually doubled from 3% to 6%. There's plenty of viewership of that. And not only is there plenty of viewership, there are even people that are streaming their own video games, just as I do with my World of Warcraft evening every Wednesday night. I don't actually do that. Don't look for me. The percentage of men who say that they have done this has gone up from 10 to 12, and the percentage of women who say they have done this has gone from 4 to 5. And I love this graph. This is that same question. Have you ever played a video game and streamed it live? And yes, it's gone up 12 to 34, but look at 55 plus. It's not zero. We're all gamers. We're all, I think, we're all at home. We're all making the best of what we have at home, and we're all gamers. So something else that we can do while we're stuck at home, John, is we can listen to online audio. So before you get into online audio, I'm just looking at the hashtag Infinite Dial on Twitter, and we have a haiku from Paul Colligan, which is lovely. And it goes like this. From Tom's couch, we learn how big podcasting is now. What mic should I buy? That's lovely, John.
You know, I had the mic problem myself earlier today as I was trying to get set up for this webinar, and I actually had to hijack part of my son's Twitch streaming setup. So he's one of those young male streamers of video games. You would not want to see me play any of those video games. Now let's jump in on online audio. In this context, online audio means the streams of AM/FM radio stations or streamed audio
has
content.
Gone from, oh, there it is. Sorry about that.
Hello, are we there?
Yeah, you disappeared on me.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to not be muted. So again, in this context, when we say online audio, we're meaning the streams of AM/FM radio stations or streamed audio content available only on the internet. And we continue to see the percentage of people who listen to online audio on at least a monthly basis increase, now at 68%, or about 192 million people. Beep. Breaking that down into demos, we see that it's the 35 to 54-year-olds driving the growth, with younger demos about flat and 55 plus increasing just a bit. Now, it might look like the growth amongst those 55 plusers is pretty small, but a jump from 40 to 42 is actually a 5% year over year increase. So that's not too shabby. Beep. Switching now to a weekly view of online audio listening. In our 2020 Infinite Dial, we're seeing the weekly reach of online audio holding steady at 60%, which is about 169 million Americans 12 plus. Beep. And after a big uptick in time spent listening in 2019, we're seeing a bit of a decrease this year to 15 hours and 12 minutes. That's about a 9% decrease from 2019's 16 hours and 43 minutes. And as you can see, we've been kind of bubbling along, going up slightly over time, but the rapid growth in time spent listening has kind of leveled off now as online audio has become such a mainstream medium. And with that, I will turn it back to Tom to dive into the specifics of online audio brands.
Thanks, John. And don't forget to use the hashtag Infinite Dial. We'll be taking whatever questions you have, comments, shout outs, and things like that at the end of the webinar. Sarah Toparoff tweeted, female gamer, AKA gamer. You damn right, Sarah Toparoff. Gamers. Yeah, bad on me for that. So let's press on with a look at audio brands and the various brands that serve the online audio space. Of course, we ask awareness first of all. And this is generally the same as it was last year. A couple of things actually went down a percentage point here and there, but did not really change in rank. Pandora leads in terms of awareness pretty handily. And then we have iHeart, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and so on. And again, these shifted around a percentage point here and there year over year, but the rank of these things relative to each other really did not change all that much. Now, one of the main measures that we look at when we gauge all of these brands in online audio are what people have listened to in the last month. And this year we are reporting a tie 12 plus. 25% of the population 12 plus have listened to Pandora in the last month, and 25% have listened to Spotify in the last month. So currently Pandora and Spotify are the two leading brands. But there's another interesting story on this particular graph as we look down through and see Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Google Play, and SoundCloud. The brand, one of the brands that's really grown here, other than, of course, Spotify, which you can see from this trend over the past 3 years, Spotify has grown from 20% in 2018 to 25% of Americans 12 plus in the past couple of years. But look at Amazon Music. Amazon Music, with the total population here, has gone from 9% to 14%. And essentially, that's vaulted it into third. And we see things like iHeart moving down to fifth on this list. And that is certainly, at least in part, and possibly a large part, driven by the incredible growth in smart speakers, and in particular, as John talked about earlier, in Amazon Alexa devices. And that is clearly driving some consumption of Amazon Music here. So again, we still see Pandora and Spotify as the top two brands. Amazon has grown a lot. And then there's not an incredible amount of movement year over year with the other two brands. And we'll just break this down briefly demographically, because there is quite a story here. If you look at 12 to 34-year-olds, Spotify is the clear number one, 12 to 34. 48% of 12 to 34-year-olds in America have listened to Spotify in the last month. Pandora is in second at 26%. But again, the real growth story here, fairly incredibly so, Amazon has doubled from 8% to 15% of 12 to 34-year-olds. And again, much of that is driven by smart speakers. And it's also worth noting here the strength of SoundCloud with 12 to 34-year-olds, which SoundCloud here is actually, in this age group, larger than Amazon, Apple, iHeart, and Google Play. So SoundCloud does have a footprint with 12 to 34-year-olds. When we look at 30...
Am I allowed to jump in and ask a question?
You are indeed, John Rosso.
Is there a differentiation here between premium subscriptions, ad-supported versus non-ad supported?
That's a very good question. In the context of infinite dial, we do not make that distinction. But in our share of ear research, we do make that distinction, and we do separate out the amount of listening to Pandora ad-supported and things like Spotify Premium, Spotify ad-supported. And so we can actually look at the share of ad-supported media. And the share of ad-supported media amongst the streaming brands, we certainly see Pandora number one. And in terms of overall listening, of course, this combines ad-supported and premium listening, and Spotify's premium brand, very, very high. But again, monthly listening overall, both brands are tied. And we continue to see, I think, a robust ecosystem for all of these brands.
Thank you. I'll be here if you need me.
Okay. I feel like I should be saying beep, but if I say beep, you can do nothing for me, John Rosso. Absolutely powerless. Okay. So when we look at brands in the last week, 22% of Americans say they've listened to Spotify in the last week, and 18% say they've listened to Pandora in the last week. And again, that represents certainly a shift over last year. Spotify now number one in weekly listening, Pandora in second place. We have seen, again, Amazon grow from 6% weekly to 10% weekly. And the other brands remain, I think, relatively static here year over year in terms of the last week. And one of the interesting things that we wanted to look at also with SiriusXM having ownership of both Pandora and SoundCloud, or investment in both, we wanted to look at the size of that platform. If once you sort of take out the duplicates, the people who listen to both, and add in all of the Pandora listeners and all of the SoundCloud listeners kind of deduplicated. And here you get that platform at 31% monthly and 21% weekly. So we wanted to put that in there because that's been sort of a more recent development in terms of in terms of audio branding. But I think overall the space continues to be robust. It continues to support a number of varying brands, and people are in fact using more than one system and more than one service. When we ask people what is the brand that you use most often, we look at the total here. 28% say Spotify and 24% say Pandora. So a very clear number 1 and 2, taking about half of the market in terms of the audio brand used most often. But again, as we did last year, it's really interesting to take a look at what happens when we see Amazon Music, which here 8% of Americans 12 plus say Amazon Music is the brand they use most often. But if you own a smart speaker, that nearly doubles to 15% in terms of Amazon being what you use most often. So smart speaker ownership, again, does change behavior. It has certainly increased Amazon's stature. And so again, this year, as we look at the brands overall, we have Pandora, we have Spotify, we have Amazon, and we have a host of other brands really occupying mind share and usage. So, and a lot of this is happening in the car, John, and I don't know about you, but I have not been in a car in a couple of weeks.
I have not been in a car in at least a week, except for foraging trips to the supermarket, which is mostly empty at the moment. So
it is indeed.
It is indeed. When I'm in that car, though, what am I listening to? Well, let's ask what most Americans are listening to, and that is AM/FM radio, which continues to lead in car listening. It's holding steady at about 81% for those people saying they have ever used it in a car. We're seeing significant increases in the number of people who have used owned digital music collections or online radio, with owned music going up 45 to 48 and online radio making a big jump from 28 to 33. Podcasts and satellite radio both saw increases as well, but it's bad news for the lowly CD player, which continued to decline a bit this year following a big drop in 2019. Beep. AM/FM radio continues to dominate with 50% of people telling us that it's the source they use most often in the car. The big jump up here is in the use of owned music. In the post-download age of streaming, it's hard to understand this increase, especially after 3 flat years. So I think there may be some confusion at play here with folks who are subscribers to playlist services, maybe such as Spotify's premium service, thinking about those playlists as their owned music and maybe confusing those two things. And that may be what's driving this big jump up this year. This slide shows us the adoption of in-dash information and entertainment systems. So these would include Apple's CarPlay, Google's Android Auto, as well as proprietary systems from certain auto manufacturers. Now, given the very long replacement cycle for cars, it's not surprising that the growth is as slow as it is. It's worth noting that our base for this graph is people 18 plus who have been in a car in the last month, driven or ridden in a car in the last month. And of those, about 18% have one of these in-dash information and entertainment systems. Now let's look at what kind of in-dash system they have. And here we're looking at a trend of both Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. We're calling these vehicle integrated mobile operating systems. You can credit Tom for that one. VMOS, I think we're going to be calling it from here on out. And Apple and Google are clearly taking the majority of market share in this category. They represent together 14% between them. And remember, on that last slide, we saw that the entire market was 18%. So these two systems together have a really predominant share of that market, with the rest undoubtedly going to proprietary manufacturers' systems. Beep. Now we'll look at online audio listening in car through a cell phone, because you know there are connected cars, vehicles that have embedded internet capabilities that allow you to consume media or do other things online. But most people who are consuming online audio in a car are doing it courtesy of their mobile device and by connecting that device to the in-car systems. So here we go back to our base of Americans 12 plus, where we see that 45% have listened in this mode. That's up from about 10%, up about 10% from last year, a pretty good move up from 41 to 45%. And now the part that Twitter informs me you've all been waiting for, news from the podcast world. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, John. And just as a reminder and to recycle a pretty good joke, if you'd like to listen to this webinar as a podcast, just close your eyes. I mean, I'm sorry, that's just too good a joke not to reuse, right?
Ba-dum-bum.
Thank you. So the first thing we track in terms of podcasting is the percentage of Americans who are familiar with the term, and the percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they at least know the term podcasting, even if they don't know what it is, which is true of millions, is now 75%. So that has gone up 5 percentage points to an even 3/4 of Americans 12 plus who say that they have at least heard the term podcasting. And that's really continued to grow from 2016 on. It's pretty steadily marched upwards. So the term is absolutely getting into the zeitgeist, or as they would say in German, the zeitgeist of American society, as more and more Americans have at least heard it bandied about, even if they haven't actually listened to one. But luckily, the percentage of Americans who have listened to one does in fact continue to grow. Today, the percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they've ever listened to a podcast is now 55 million Americans, or 55% of Americans 12 plus, and that's 155 million Americans say that they have ever listened to a podcast. So we reached the halfway point last year. We continue to march upward there. 5 percentage points of growth. That number does indeed continue to go up. And as you might expect, if that number is going to go up, the monthly podcast listening number is also going up. And we actually report a fairly significant growth here. The percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they've ever listened to a podcast in the last month has gone from 32%, nearly a third, to 37%. And that means that the number of Americans who have listened to a podcast in the last month has breached the 100 million mark and is now at approximately 104 million Americans, certainly a medium to take seriously for advertisers, for the public, as we crest that 100 million American point. So we've gone up 32%, from 32% last year to 37% this year. So that's fairly significant growth. And we can see that both with men and with women as we continue to approach sort of equality here in terms of the percentage of each who have listened to a podcast in the last month. 39% of men say they've listened to a podcast in the last month, and 36% of women say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And the latter, that's significant growth from 2017 especially. We continue to see pretty steady growth, 12 to 34. I know we reported last year that a lot of that is being driven by Spotify, and certainly Spotify's increased share, especially on the young end with podcast listeners, is at least a part of this. But today, nearly half of 12 to 34-year-olds say they've listened to a podcast in the last month, 49%. 40% of 35 to 54-year-olds say they've listened to one. And look at 55 plus. That's a fairly significant piece of growth right there, from 17% last year to 22% of 55 and older say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. In terms of the folks who have listened to podcasts, the gender basically here is pretty equal. 51% of men, 49% of women, which is essentially what the U.S. population is, say that they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And we do see, when you compare the age of the U.S. population to the age of the monthly podcast listener, there is a bulge here, 12 to 34, and that bulge is a fairly new bulge. Podcasting really, in its sort of early and middle years, was more of a, I would say, 25 to 44 medium. But now we're seeing a lot more young adults and teens and tweens becoming interested in podcasting as they are getting more and more content to consume. And so there is that bulge there when we look at monthly podcast consumers. And the increasing diversity of the podcast audience is something to take note of here. When we look at the ethnic composition of monthly podcast consumers compared to the U.S. population, it does lean a little bit wider than the population. We see Asian a little bit higher. We do see Hispanic a little bit lower, but we are actually in the process of fielding a significant survey of Hispanic and Latinx podcast consumers, and we hope to come up with that very soon to really take a deep dive into that segment of our population, and hopefully that will continue to expand and approach at least what the U.S. population looks like. Now let's take a look at weekly podcast listening. That too has grown. That's grown from 22% to 24%. Not the jump that we saw last year from 2018 to 2019, kind of more on par with what it has been doing, which is, sort of a long series of 1 to 2 percentage point jumps year over year, and it keeps marching up there. And that's certainly something that we're going to want to keep a close eye on year over year as we look at people taking podcasts from something that they try once in a while to something that really becomes part of their weekly habit. Certainly the proliferation of daily podcasts has had a little bit to do with that. But I think it's also worth noting that we spend a lot of time thinking about downloads in podcasting. And there are lots of ways to increase our download numbers. There are lots of levers that you can pull with that. You can increase the number of shows in a feed. You can increase the cadence of your show. And I think, as I've written before, it's really important for the podcast industry and the people producing podcasts to also think very hard about reach and increasing this number, the percentage of people who know about these shows and who do indeed listen to these shows. And that's important, especially when you look at the average time spent listening to podcasts, which over the past 3 years has been fairly flat. It's about 6.5 hours per week. And I can tell you, in our share of year data, we look at the share of year amongst podcast listeners, amongst the people who tell us that they do listen to podcasts. What percentage of all of the audio that they listen to is podcast audio? And while that percentage is certainly the plurality of their listening at about 28%, it's been about 28% for a few years now. So increasing that percentage, increasing the time spent listening is a tougher, I think, a tougher road here than increasing the number of people who listen to podcasts. So I think as an industry, focusing both on downloads but also on reach is really going to start to drive these numbers. And then finally, before we get to Q&A and some other things, we asked weekly podcast listeners, how many podcasts did you listen to in the last week? And this year, that's 6 podcasts. It was 7 last year, and then a few years before that, it was 5. And again, I think this holds with what I just talked about, that there's probably a limit on the number of podcasts that the same people can listen to, and whether that's 6 or 7 or 6.5 hours a week or 7 hours a week, it's hard to say. But I think increasing the reach of the medium should really be the focus of the medium over the next couple of years. So we're going to get to some observations here. We do have Q&A. I'll be answering some of the questions that people have put on Twitter, like what am I wearing? And we'll get to some of that in a moment. But first, I think let's have a look at sort of the big findings, the big observations that we have seen year over year. And I think really the biggest story, monthly podcast consumers have grown by 16% year over year. We've now crested 100 million Americans for the first time. About 104 million Americans say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. That is indeed a significant milestone. And we continue to see growth in weekly and ever listening and certainly familiarity.
And approximately 169 million Americans listened to online audio in the last week. That's about 60% of the population. And they spent an average of over 15 hours, actually 15 hours and 12 minutes doing so.
More than 6 in 10 Americans, 62% in fact, use some form of voice assistant technology. And certainly the smart speaker has had a lot to do with that. And I think as people have learned how to use smart speakers, they are then using that technology on their phone where previously they may not have. And I think all of that means that if you are a content producer, it's incumbent upon you to make sure that your content is easily retrievable through voice. And I think not everybody has solved that.
Tom, I'm thinking about, or back to that gap between the number of people who use voice assistants, which was over 60%, and the number who own smart speakers, which was less than half that number. I think it was 27%. That's a big gap. And that gap really speaks to how the embedding of these voice assistants is becoming more of a driver here, becoming more sort of prevalent in our everyday devices, not just hardware meant to access these personal assistants, but in all sorts of other things as well. And my next observation here, so with nearly a third of smart speaker owners having 3 or more devices in their homes, there's increased opportunity to produce audio for environments and context previously underserved. And I'm thinking again about all of that opportunity, Tom, for your podcast to grow in bathroom listening.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I really think I was meant for the bathroom, John. Now, we've seen smartphone, tablet, and smartwatch penetration really stalled out, and they've really been stalled for the past few years. So currently, really the kind of last frontier for significant digital audio growth is in-car. And there is certainly a significant potential for in-car listening to digital audio. We continue to slowly buy new cars, which is going to turn over the availability of that technology on the dashboard, still largely coming from the smartphone. But as I think more and more integrated and then soon voice assistant integrated systems are in the car, then that's really going to unlock a significant amount of in-car digital audio consumption.
Yeah, it's clear that in-car media users continue to incorporate digital audio in their listening, although AM/FM remains strong and in the lead by a pretty big margin. We did see a big increase in the use of owned digital music in-car, along with a significant increase in the connecting of mobile devices to in-car systems this year.
Yeah, and we saw a big decline in CD ownership or CD usage in the car year over year. And I don't know if you've looked at your pile of CDs lately, John. It's like a fossilized record of the Styx Paradise Theater epic.
Yeah. I'm using Winger as coasters at the moment.
Winger as coasters. Sorry, Kip, if you're listening. Pandora and Spotify are tied amongst Americans 12 plus for monthly usage, while Amazon Music has become a strong third, at least in terms of monthly usage 12 plus, really buoyed by smart speaker owners. And we saw that in that question we showed earlier with the percentage of Americans who say that it's the service that they listen to the most. With smart speaker owners, Amazon was nearly double what it is with the general population.
And so while certain social media platforms are growing, others are shrinking, and the growth cycle seems to have ended, though Instagram is one of those that continues to show growth, and TikTok has made very strong early gains. And Tom, I've been thinking that perhaps next year we should release the Infinite Dial as a TikTok dance.
You know, if we could get this down to 10 seconds, the Infinite Dial,
done.
I'm completely down with that. So we're going to get to some of your questions here in a moment. One thing I do want to announce here is that we are going to be starting, we always put out lots of webinars here at Edison, but we're going to make a kind of a bi-weekly webinar series, which for those of us who are working at home, I think probably many of us on this call, hopefully will be a welcome thing. And we're going to start on April 2nd with something near and dear to both of our hearts, John, and that is the Infinite Dial as a content marketing program. You know, we were very proud last year at both Edison and Triton to win the Content Marketing Institute's Content Marketing Award for Best Use of Original Research in Content Marketing, and we beat out some pretty large brands. So we were proud of that, John.
So the quality of the hosting, I believe.
100% quality of the hosting, and really how well we make up these numbers.
Nothing to do with the research.
Nothing to do. So we're going to look at sort of the behind the scenes of that, how that's become such a really a successful content marketing pillar for us, in as well as being kind of a milestone and flagship research project for us. A couple weeks after that, Larry Rosen is going to present a webinar called Portents for November, a review of the Edison Research Democratic primary exit polls. If you've been watching any of the exit polling information on NBC, CNN, CBS, et cetera, that all comes from us, and Larry's going to break that down. We have a few more Infinite Dials coming up, so do follow us. Follow us at edisonresearch.com on Twitter, at Triton Digital on Twitter, and I think it's probably time for us to take some questions, John. I don't know about you, but I'm ready.
Prepared. I will tell you that I've been sort of monitoring Twitter as you've been wrapping up here, and Twitter really, the thing that Twitter is blown up about right now is your repeated use of the word bulge in an Infinite Dial presentation.
Is that so? Okay.
That is so.
Well, and I'm going to get to just a couple of the questions that were asked of us here. Brett Kinsella, hey.
We lost you, Tom. You're muted.
Growth is attributable. I'm not muted.
Oh, now you're back. You were gone for a minute.
Now I'm back. Yeah, I'm back with a vengeance. And I'm angry. I got to tell you, John, I'm strung out and I need this. All right, here we go. Brett Kinsella from VoiceBot AI asks, what % of the podcast listening growth is attributable to more radio programming being made on demand as podcasts? I would say not the majority of it. catch-up radio is definitely a part of that, and sort of as folks in the UK would call it, catch-up radio. But it's still really overwhelmingly, I think, being driven by original content. But it's not a monolithic field. It's not a monolithic medium. There's all of these things are contributing to its growth. So Lindsay Bowen, we know Lindsay, asks, I wonder if solving discovery and personalization problems helps with TSL. I bet that it does. So one thing I think is definitely true about the discovery issue. I think the discovery issue is as much people not knowing that they need or want to listen to podcasts. And there's a huge percentage of those people out there. I don't know what you think about that, John, but the percentage of people who want to discover a podcast needs to go up too.
Yeah, and the people who are into podcasting do know where to go to find more, I think. I just think it's the newbies to it, the people who are just maybe discovering it, who haven't quite figured out where to go beyond that one podcast that was recommended to them.
Yeah. Christine O'Donnell asks, any idea on how COVID-19 is influencing podcast listenership? We are going to know that soon. We don't know that now. It's not something that we've tracked in Infinite Dial. We do two other kind of regular subscription products called Share of Ear and the Podcast Consumer Tracker, which are regularly surveying people. And I will say this, I had a comment in James Cridland's Pod News about this on Monday. I don't think we should assume that podcast listening is going to go up right now, because what happens in discontinuous periods in our history like this, whether it's a superstorm or some other kind of event, is that media listening becomes all willy-nilly. It goes haywire in unpredictable ways. And although many of us, like John and I, are working from home, that doesn't necessarily mean we have the context and the environment to listen to more podcasts. If you're used to commuting and you're not commuting, that's time maybe you're not listening. If you're home and you have kids at home, good luck doing anything except homeschooling those children and feeding them. But I don't know, John, what's your perspective on
there's
media
definitely
consumption?
a disruption, and from my own personal habits, listening less to daily news-driven podcasts, which is on a normal workday, what I spend most of my time listening to when I'm listening to podcasts, and instead, my news is coming live from broadcast, television or radio, just because of the timing component of it. And my podcast consumption has gone to more maybe lean back, you would call it, or more entertainment than information. And, going back to, Welcome to Night Vale and stuff like that.
Paul Colligan, he of the haiku, which I think will go into the annals of history, the annals of poetic truth, I think, asks, any research on podcast types or genres and growth, i.e. daily news gaining over dudes talking about sports, that kind of thing. We published at the end of last year a genre ranker, and we are going to update that. That comes from our Podcast Consumer Tracker, so it's based on actual podcasts listened to. And, comedy is by far the number one. And it's really going to be interesting over the next few weeks to see if those things sort of morph and migrate. And we will track them. It would not surprise me if there's a bit of a, flight to comfort for some people. Some people may kind of studiously avoid the news, and some people will stare right into it.
This is true.
Sky Alphabet Social Media. Hello, Sky Alphabet Social Media. My grandmother's middle name was Alphabet Social. Sky Alphabet Social Media asks, can we post these slides to Instagram and Twitter, or what is your policy, or what is your deal, dude? And yes, you can. We'd love it if you use the hashtag, but all of these slides can in fact be posted as you wish on any of the socials, and we do appreciate you sharing.
I'm surprised that this was not the very first question that was asked, but will these slides be made available?
That's amazing. It was not the very first question asked. These slides will, of course, be made available. The slides and the video of the webinar will be made available very, very shortly at edisonresearch.com and tritondigital.com. And again, you're always free to use these slides. Please make sure that you just attribute them to the Infinite Dial 2020 from Edison Research and Triton Digital. Use all you want, and we'll continue to make more. Let's see.
But at a time, but there's at least one more question I'd like to get in.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Brett Hill writes, enjoyed the podcast. Do you have a code where I can get a cheap mattress?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do actually have a code where you can get a cheap mattress. Just go to infinitedial.com/stanky-old-mattress. And you'll save 50% off our $20 mattresses. Because we're a high value brand, John.
Indeed.
We're a high value brand. Let's see. What other? Brett Kinsella also adds, the coronavirus story is moving so quickly that podcasts are out of cycle when they hit. They'll be critical in providing a perspective in the future, but we'll take a backseat to broadcast while the trajectory is moving so quickly. John Rosso is right. John Rosso is right. I've always known that. I don't know if there are any, so we have Team Edison on standby, and Team Edison has been looking at some of the questions that have been posted perhaps in the question box or the chat in GoToMeeting. Do we have any questions from the folks in the back in the office, which the office is a collection of individual homes?
Hello, yes, this is Laura. We do have several questions that we can get to, but before we do that, I want to show, I'm going to actually hand this over to our colleague Megan Lazovic, and she's going to show, we encourage people to take an infinite dial selfie as they're watching this in their remote locations, or infinite selfie, if you will.
That's awesome. Are you taking an infinite selfie, John?
I am.
So I did not take an infinite selfie, but my wife Tamsin is right in front of me, and so she took a picture of the entire all of this that's going on right here, and posted it onto Twitter. So the view that no one else has.
So Megan, when you're ready, you should be able to share that image.
Infinite selfies. Look at that.
That's great. That's awesome.
That is so. Oh, hey, Tom and John from London. Oh, thanks, Minter. That's awesome. Well, we appreciate all the infinite selfies. Evo Terra asks on Twitter, what about asking people about smart earbuds for next year? What about it, Evo? What about it? I think that's a good idea. We do. There are a lot of questions in the Infinite Dial series, in both the telephone survey and in the related online survey that we do in conjunction with it. And we're, some of those questions do get asked from year to year. So it's interesting. I don't know what's happening with the wearables in terms of the hearables market. We've seen some brands come and go, but certainly AirPods are continuing to dominate in that. And let's see. Jeff Large has sent us a picture of a baby. All right. Thanks for that. Babies are big fans of the Infinite Dial. We know that.
All right. So Tom and John, Bill asks, does Edison have information on whether growth in podcast listenership is based on a handful of shows or across a broader base of shows?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that we have reported for sure in our podcast consumer tracker data, I mean, there are some clear hits, right? I mean, the Joe Rogan show is clearly the #1 podcast in America. And, that's a show that combines, that actually has reach on its own. But a lot of podcasting continues to be just a giant broad base of many, many shows. And we're starting to see some of the leading networks start to put together really broad-based reach coalitions by increasing the diversity of the programming that they have. But in terms of the giant broad-reaching hits like you might see on the hottest Netflix movie or television or something like that, that's not what's driving podcasting. They're very important, but it's still really being driven by a broad base and a very, very long tail.
Yeah, podcasting really isn't a reach medium. I don't know what the exact numbers are on Joe Rogan, but I think it's about 2.5 million, daily downloads or episode downloads,
yeah,
which is probably, roughly equivalent to its reach. So that's something short of 1% of the U.S. 18 plus population. So that's the biggest show in podcasting, reaching less than 1% on its own.
Well, we show it a bit higher in the podcast consumer tracker with weekly podcast consumers. And a lot of that is on YouTube, which of course does not get factored into those download numbers. It's still, it's still a podcast, and Rogan's listeners still perceive it as a podcast, but there's incredible YouTube consumption. Todd Cochran just tweeted his infinite dial selfie. Thanks, Todd. Greetings up in snowy, cold as crap Michigan, wherever you are, sheltering in place. Any other questions from the Edison team?
We have a two-part question from Gary Krantz. One, is there more data on what devices people listen to? A, online audio, and B, podcasts? And two, will Infinite Dial get more granular in terms of audio categories, news, talk, comedy, political, etc., and various genres of music? That was a big one.
That's a good one. Yeah, I'm not sure if the Infinite Dial is going to get that granular. We have plenty of things that do get that granular. We are tracking those things in other surveys, and we are tracking in Infinite Dial things like device usage and platform usage and things like that. This is really the survey course, but we are in fact tracking all of those things, and I would expect us to release some of those things in the near future. So John, I see people are starting to shuffle off. Let's see if there's anything else on. Dave Jackson has done his selfie. Appreciate that, Dave. Any final words for the folks at home, which is everybody?
Well, first, thanks. Thank you to everybody who took the time from childcare or whatever else they're already being distracted from their jobs with to join us today. Really, really happy to see the huge turnout that we had today. It was terrific. Sorry we weren't able to pull off the live event that we planned, but there's always next year.
There's always next year. Yeah. Well, I did in fact have a live event here, but no one showed up. The couch is empty. And I want to give a very, very special shout out to the team behind the scenes at Triton and Edison under extraordinary circumstances with primaries going on for us and childcare. I'm in awe of the diligence and the attention to detail that goes into this, and I'm so appreciative of that. And we're very appreciative of you. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next
year. Wash your hands.
Wash your hands. Cheers.
Bye, Tom.
Bye, John.